Welcome to the 2022 Brown Bag Lunch and Learn series. It is hosted by the Friends of Birmingham Botanical Gardens. My name is Dawn Coleman Lee. I'm the Education Activity Specialist for the Friends, and it is hosted in conjunction with City of Birmingham Stormwater Management, Jefferson County Department of Health, Stormwater Management Authority Incorporated, Alabama Green Industry Training Center, Alabama Cooperative Extension System, City of Leeds, Alabama, and Jefferson County Stormwater Program. And today we have a presentation by Dr. Jim Jacoby with Alabama Cooperative Extension. And here to introduce him is John Neighbors with Alabama Green Industry Training Center.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Glad to see a good crowd this morning. My pleasure to introduce Dr. Jim Jacoby, a plant pathologist with, of course, Alabama Extension. We work together on a lot of different avenues. And Jim Jacoby, employed with Extension as a Extension plant pathologist, has a BS in forestry from University of Vermont and a master's in forest pathology from Clemson University with his doctorate degree in plant pathology from Auburn University. For the last 20 years, managed the Extension Plant Diagnostic Lab there at the Birmingham Botanical Gardens at the C. Beatty Hanna Center. And so from my background, from prior to being an Extension employee, Dr. Jacoby has been an excellent resource for industry and a friend to not only industry, many homeowners, and we're excited to hear what he has to say. I know Boxwood Blight is Boxwood 101 will be a concentration area today on talking about all things Boxwood. So let Dr. Jacoby get started. Glad to be here with you all this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John. Yes. All righty. How's that look, John?
Looks good. See it full screen. So
Okay. So today we're going to talk about boxwoods primarily. Maybe in the future, when I was putting this together, there was just so much information, and I had such a big problem with boxwood blight last year that I decided to focus more on that. And maybe in the future we can talk about some azalea problems in the future at another time. Just too much to cover in just 1 hour. So Boxwood Blight is a fungal disease, and it is caused by this fungus called Calanectria pseudonoviculatum. And it was first reported in the United Kingdom and New Zealand back in the 1990s. And it's spread throughout the rest of Europe. And in the United States, we first found it in 2011 in North Carolina and in Connecticut. And currently it's found in 30 different states. And this is just a map showing kind of where it's found right now. So you can see pretty much everything east of the Mississippi, we found boxwood blight by this time. So first you can see the states that it showed up in, first in North Carolina, in Connecticut, and quickly some of the other surrounding states, Virginia, but also out in Oregon, which also produces a lot of boxwoods. In Alabama, we found it first here in the Birmingham area back in 2013. And then you can see the other states slowly, as we've seen more and more just up to the last one being found in Mississippi last year. So what's the history in Alabama? So I run the diagnostic lab here at the Birmingham Botanical Gardens for the extension system. And back in 2013, had the first sample come in of a boxwood with this disease. And so I'd been to some meetings and quickly recognized that this was a case of Boxwood Blight. And so that in that case, all the boxwoods at that location were dug up and destroyed. And they eventually planted more boxwoods in that landscape. And as of just a couple months ago, the disease never showed back up in that location. So that was great. So in 2014, I didn't see any samples. 2015, we saw 3, and some of those were at garden centers. 2016 saw a combination of a few at garden centers and also a few landscapes in the area. 2017, still relatively low numbers, just 2 new infections or 2 landscapes that showed it. And then in 2018, about a half a dozen landscapes with the disease. 2019, just 1. But something changed when we had the last 2 years of rainy weather. So in 2020, we had a dozen samples that came into the lab that had Boxwood Blight. And that was out of nearly 70 samples or 68 samples throughout the year of boxwoods that people brought to me to be diagnosed. All 12 of those samples I received late in the season, so between August and November. And then last year, you remember how rainy it was during the summertime? It just started to rain in June. It really didn't seem to stop well into fall. And that was just the perfect storm for this disease. We had 62 new locations with the disease, and that was out of 128 total boxwood samples that I received. So about half of the samples, but half of the samples didn't have Boxwood Blight. And I'm going to talk about some of the other things that you might confuse with Boxwood Blight, so we get a good diagnosis and understand what we can do about the disease boxwoods in our landscapes. Again, in 2021, 57 out of 62. Again, most of those samples were received in that August to November. And last fall, it was unusually rainy. Had a lot of rain in both September and October, which are typically our driest months. And that really pushed the infections way into where this disease was active up until we started to get really cold temperatures during November. So let's try to learn a little bit and how to recognize the symptoms of Boxwood Blight. The first things to look for are, number 1, brown leaf spots. And a lot of times the brown leaf spots, they start out small and they grow, and oftentimes they'll have a dark brown border and a lighter center, almost like what we call a frog eye leaf spot. But when this disease is really going, a lot of times I get samples that don't have any leaf spots. One symptom that is real consistent between samples is where you can see in this picture, you'll get these black stem lesions. And it looks almost like you took a Sharpie or something and made these black little narrow lines on the boxwood, green boxwood stems. Really sticks out. And for me, that's a really good diagnostic symptom. When I see this kind of symptom with these narrow stem lesions, every case I've been able to either isolate or detect the fungus in these samples. And the third major symptom to look for is you're going to notice that infected plants defoliate. The leaves drop off. So you'll get infected leaves, they turn brown, but then they drop oftentimes within a week or 2. So the leaf loss is often one of the things that you'll notice in plants that are infected. So again, those stem lesions, so this is a typical sample that would come into the lab last fall. And you can see the stem lesions, those black streaks on the stems, also black spots on the leaves. But again, this for me really is a key symptom that differentiates it from a lot of other boxwood problems. And when I see that, you know, it's like I said, in every case, it's been boxwood blight. One thing you may see if you've had plants that have become infected is that you may have a completely brown plant, but after a few weeks, you may get some regrowth. And those plants will regrow. Those leaves typically will get infected, and this will go through these cycles if you don't try to control the disease. And eventually the plant typically will die, but it doesn't die right away. So as far as, let's learn a little bit about the biology and the spread of this fungus. First thing is, like so many fungal diseases, it likes the conditions to be warm and wet. That's really favorable. And kind of the sweet spot for temperatures is between 60 and 85, with 77 being the optimum. This fungus is able to produce these hard masses of fungal cells within the leaves, shown on the right in these little blue little splotches that we call, the pathologists call microsclerotia. And that allows the fungus to survive just laying on the ground as a dead leaf for up to 5 years. And so that can really complicate things going forward if you have this fungus just kind of hanging out on the ground where it's been before. It also overwinters from year to year on those infected stems, but also on those fallen leaves too. One of the things about this disease is it has a relatively narrow host range, meaning the plants that can get sick from boxwood blight include boxwoods, basically any Boxus species. Pachysandra is another one, which is also in the boxwood family, and sweet box or Sarcococa. Now, it's important to kind of recognize that these other plants can be infected, the Pachysandra and the sweet box, because you could buy and infect a Pachysandra that has boxwood blight on there, or you may have some Pachysandra in the landscape that may be sick and spreading the disease to your boxwoods. Another important thing is that we haven't been able to find a boxwood variety that's 100% resistant to this disease. So, and we'll talk about that later, but we have found some really good sources of at least tolerant or partially resistant varieties that you can maybe use in the future as far as planting where you've had boxwood blight. So when I get samples into the lab, I'm always looking for those other things, those lookalike problems that people suspect are boxwood blight, but they're not. The first and probably the most common is one called Volutella Blight. And this can cause stem dieback. Sometimes even whole sections of the plant will decline. This is a relatively slow developing disease that you'll often see in the springtime. And what I'll look for in the lab is that it produces these salmon or pink colored spores masses on the bottoms of the leaves, but also on the stems. So you can see those masses of pink or salmon colored spores, and then again on the bottoms of the leaves and on the stems. Another common thing that I'll see that might be confused with boxwood blight is the #1 insect problem on boxwood. That's boxwood leafminer. What you'll see is typically it causes yellow blotches or on the leaves, but in some cases they'll turn into brown spots, as you can see here. Now, boxwood blight typically doesn't create these yellow splotches like that, so we can differentiate that. But in cases where we see the brown spots, one way to see if it's boxwood blight or not is that boxwood leafminer creates these blister-like swellings on the bottoms of the leaves. And if you break those open, especially in the early spring, you're going to see larva inside. And you can see in this leaf, there's just bunches of larvae. There typically is going to be, you break open a leaf and you're going to find, you know, maybe 1, 2, or 3. But this is one I broke open and there's 20 larvae. So this is like the world record Boxwood Leafminer infection in this case. Another problem that often gets brought in and people think is Boxwood blight is damage from the black twig borer. So this is a little tiny ambrosia beetle that bores into the stem of the boxwood, and you'll get a dead stem shown here by these kind of straw colored areas. And if you look back on this stem that's dead, you're going to find a little tiny hole about less than 1 millimeter, kind of pencil lead thickness. And inside, if you break open that stem, there's going to be a cavity where those, you'll often find the beetles inside. So this is the adult beetle, dark brown, chestnut brown, and then the young creamy larva are the young beetles inside that stem. You also notice that this beetle brings in a fungus, which the larvae eat, but it also causes this discoloration of the wood of the boxwood. And it's really the reason why you get the dieback. So that fungus that gets introduced by the beetle causes the dieback of the stems. I often see this on plants that are stressed. You can see these plants really don't appear that healthy. They're discolored. They're thin, a lot of orange leaves. So especially the orange leaves really oftentimes tell me that plant is stressed. Could be a fertility issue, could be drought stress. A lot of things can cause it, but those plants are often preferentially attacked. But like last summer, I saw some very healthy boxwoods show with black twig borer damage. And in fact, last year, it was the second most common problem to boxwood blight. When you see this, it's really important to cut out all these stems. And if you do it during the wintertime, the beetles are inside and you can destroy that, put it in the garbage, get it away from the boxwoods and get rid of those clippings, and you'll get rid of the beetles. Another look-alike problem, which looks very similar to the black twig borer damage, is called boxwood stem canker. I see this in Japanese and Korean boxwoods primarily. And again, you're going to get dieback of the stems. And much like the black twig borer, you're going to get a discoloration of the wood, but you're not going to see any holes in the side where the beetle has gotten in. We do lab tests to confirm that it's boxwood stem canker, but you can see if you make a cut, look at the cut end, and you're going to have this black discoloration in the wood. So this is healthy wood, and this is the disease wood on that side. Another problem, especially in the spring, that I see is, it could be a combination of things. Like in this case, these are some boxwoods that are off color. There's some orange areas, like I've taken a picture here, a lot of yellow leaves, and this could be a combination of stress, infertility, many different things. But again, this isn't boxwood blight. And a lot of times in the springtime, you'll also see older leaves that are turning yellow. And some of that is just the natural seasonal leaf drop as you'll get new growth on the boxwoods. And it's just typically lasts only a few weeks. Those leaves drop and it's nothing to worry about. Again, the leaves are dropping that are yellow. They're not like boxwood blight where they're going to be brown and dead leaves. So how does the disease spread? This is a really important thing to understand. The spores of this fungus are large and sticky, and they're not really spread like so many other fungi readily via air currents. So because they're sticky, they can stick to things. They can stick to tools, they can stick to clothing, vehicles, all sorts of things, and be carried from one property to the next. They also can be introduced into a landscape on infected boxwoods. That was the original way that it was getting into landscapes, or through some type of infected plant debris. Maybe it was greenery or wreaths, boxwood wreaths that were infected during the holidays. And once you have an infected boxwood, then it spreads throughout the landscape by these, since the spores really don't spread easily by air currents, they're typically spread by splashing rain and wind-driven rains that carry the spores from plant to plant. Another way that they can be spread from property to property is by contaminated animals. Dogs, deer, birds are also a potential way, but I think in most cases we're dealing with either moving on contaminated tools or infected plants. So this picture just shows kind of all the different ways that the fungus can spread either into the landscape, or once it gets into the landscape, how it can be spread throughout to other plants within the landscape. So introduction of infected plants, again, that's going to be a primary route to get it into your landscape. It can also be spread because of those sticky spores on gloves and tools, and things like leaf blowers can blow infected leaves from one property to another. That's another way to move it around. And again, once that fungus gets in and infects a plant, those leaves that drop to the ground in that infested leaf litter, that will then again be a spot where it overwinters, but it'll also splash back up onto the plants and reinfect the plants. So this one really depicts it well. We could look at this for a long time, but I think we need to move on. So here's a typical scenario where we get some infected boxwoods. And so in this case, we have an old established American boxwood or common boxwood, and we've introduced a couple new boxwoods that were infected. If you can see down at the bottom, you can see some rapid defoliation. There's leaves on the ground, and this is typically how it develops. So you'll get some spread from these plants that were brought in to the old established plants. And within an infected plant, it starts typically low down on the plant and on the lower branches, and then moves up in the canopy as you get more and more infection and as the season progresses. You know, we think about, because of how it can be introduced on new plants, I always recommend to think twice about adding plants. So we have in this picture these beautiful old common boxwoods that have been there for decades. They're healthy, look good. So this would be an indication to me, if I had some old boxwoods like that, I would really think twice about bringing in new boxwoods, just because of the risk of introducing infected plants. And when you're buying boxwoods, you know, really check them out, buy wisely. You know, look for signs of leaf spots, those stem lesions that I looked at. And even after you buy the boxwoods, I would quarantine them. I would keep them separated in an area away from all my boxwoods. And I would keep them there for several weeks, maybe 3 to 4 weeks. And the reason why I do that is because most of the nurseries are going to be spraying their boxwoods with fungicides, and that can suppress boxwood blight. And if you leave them in your land, in this quarantined area for about a month, that allows the fungicide effects to wear off. And if the plants have any disease that you didn't really notice, it should show up. And then before you put them in the landscape, you can return them and get some new plants. So I mentioned that there was no boxwoods that were 100% resistant, but some of the early research done by Kelly Ivers and others at North Carolina State back in 2014 showed that there was a big difference in the susceptibility of the common commercial varieties. And there's been many more studies that have been done since that point, since that time, looking for resistant varieties. So the most susceptible are up here at the top. So we have Buxus sempervirens fruticosa, that's dwarf English boxwood. By far, they consider it what they call the positive control. It is the most susceptible variety out there. And I would really think twice about, in the future, buying dwarf English boxwoods because of their susceptibility to this disease. There's so many boxwoods that are much better. Dwarf English boxwoods are also very prone to root rot in some of our locations, some of our soils. I would be looking for varieties towards the bottom. These are much more resistant or tolerant of the and the least susceptible available. Things like Green Beauty and Winter Gem, those are two that really have performed consistently well. And here's a few more boxwoods that are less susceptible to Boxwood Blight. So again, I mentioned Winter Gem and Green Beauty. Little Missy came out a few years ago. It's a very small boxwood, maybe for some border plantings. Doesn't get very big, but there's been a really big push looking for new varieties. In the last few years, Saunders Brothers out of Virginia came out with the New Gen Boxwood series. Two of these are available now, and their availability has really increased, and these should even be available this summer. Freedom and Independence, especially Freedom. Freedom is very much like Green Beauty, but it is much more resistant to Boxwood Leafminer. Better boxwoods are a set of varieties that came out of some research in Belgium, and those varieties have been brought back to the United States, and those should, I think there's 4 of those, and those should be more available next year. So in the future, I think there's going to be, some much, we want to continue to use boxwoods in our landscapes. And I think there's going to be more varieties that are resistant to Boxwood Blight, and that's really great. I always remember that since boxwoods are mainly the only plant that gets this disease, you can grow, all the azaleas, camellias, different types of holly. Those are all going to be immune to Boxwood Blight. They're not going to get it. So there's so many other plants that you could grow, and that's another option. One important thing to also remember is, avoid working in boxwood plantings when the foliage is wet. So no pruning, because that can, spread the fungus. That's very conducive conditions. And one of the things we can do is use drip irrigation. So we keep the leaves as dry as possible. We can't, stop those rainy days and getting leaves wet through rainfall and high humidity, but we can use drip irrigation rather than sprinkler irrigation. And, that can really reduce the chances of getting this disease. So this is a planting where you can see terrible damage. You see the spots in this particular planting. It's also important to sanitize the tools. Since the spores are sticky, they stick to all these tools, and just using 70% alcohol, rubbing alcohol straight out of the bottle, that works very well to dip tools in, or you can put it in a little sprayer and spray it on on your tools between plantings. Or you could use the Lysol disinfectant spray. That's primarily alcohol, and that's also a good sanitizer for tools. Another great idea, I think, is to use clippers or tools only on your property. So maybe you have a landscaper that helps you with your pruning. You may consider, just having clippers that they just use on your property and they don't use them anywhere else. And that can limit the movement of the fungus from property to property. I also recommend that you try to avoid shearing plants. Or at least if you have to shear, prune during the dormant period when the temperatures are cooler, below the activity levels of the fungus. We want to prune boxwoods to create air movement, and shearing often creates these really dense canopies like this in the picture. And this is just perfect conditions for boxwood to develop in those conditions. Some research has also shown that mulching can slow down and prevent boxwood blight. Did a study where they went back in a location that had the disease. They mulched some plants, they didn't mulch others, and they saw a huge reduction in the number of spots on the mulch plants, 97% reduction. So that creates like this physical barrier. Remember, those leaves that were infected could carry the disease for up to 5 years. So if you have that barrier or that layer of mulch, that will block the spores and cover them up so you don't get the splashing of the spores up onto the plants because you have that layer of mulch. And it really doesn't matter, pine bark, pine straw, keep it relatively shallow, only adding about 1/2 inch to 1 inch every spring to renew that mulch layer. And it's important to get good coverage. I mean, you're trying to create a barrier, so you want to be consistent and not have any breaks in your coverage of where the mulch is. So what happens when you bring a sample to me and I said, okay, you have boxwood blight. So what do you do now? Kind of try to go through some of the scenarios, but there's definitely, we're going to bag the infected material and we're going to dispose of them in a landfill or, to get rid of it, get it out of the site. We're not going to compost any of the diseased tissue on site. And there's a couple ways to approach this. Typically for severely infected plants, I'm going to recommend that you remove those infected plants, particularly if it's just a few plants and the rest of them are healthy, to get rid of those infected plants. In some cases, you can also approach it to prune out the disease stems and the foliage, especially if it's a new localized infection on a plant or a couple plants, and then start a spray program to protect the plants from the disease and from additional infections. Now, there's some pro and cons with both of these. Once you start to prune and then get into a spray program, it's something that you're going to have to keep up, for a long period of time. And so that's something to think about. When you have infected material, I'm going to recommend that you use, you can rake it up, but to really get all those infected leaves up, using a shop vac, to remove as many of those leaves from the ground. Again, just a few leaves can carry that fungus for 5 years. Once you get it in the landscape and you want to keep the boxwoods, you need to protect the foliage from additional disease. And so you need to spray with a fungicide program. And as a general rule, about every 14 days, real severe conditions, we may close that down to every 10 days. And you're gonna need to spray throughout the growing season, typically from April through October. So that's a long-term investment, a lot of work, a lot of expense, but it can be very successful if you keep up with that program. One thing to remember is that these are preventative treatments. We're trying to protect the healthy leaves, the healthy twigs, and keep them healthy. And also, every property and client is unique. So it's tough for me to give a standard recommendation because some people want to do everything they can to save the boxwoods. In other cases, the risk and the expense, they may want to go to a different type of planting. So here's the fungicides. Basically, we have 3 active ingredients: chlorothalonil, tebuconazole, and propiconazole. Chlorothalonil, or Daconil, as it's typically often its common name, Daconil, been around for a very long time, and it is rated the top. A lot of times we'll ask, people will ask, I want the best fungicide out there, and these are chlorothalonil, something you can buy at big box stores, at local garden centers, local hardware stores, and it's the same and the best fungicide as a landscaper or a commercial person would use. So that's a very effective product. And there's a lot of different brand names, from the Fertilome, High Yield, Bonide has their brand, Orthros, those are all have that same active ingredient. The disease control for roses, flowers, and shrubs, that's tebuconazole, that's also very good. And the liquid systemic fungicide, Fertilome. These two are closely related fungicides, same group of fungicides. They're systemic, so they get into the plant. Chlorothalonil basically is not systemic in the plant. It creates this paint-like barrier to prevent the infection. So it would also be good to use not just one fungicide, but also incorporate maybe some tebuconazole or propiconazole, maybe every other application. In some cases, clients will also mix these, either chlorothalonil with the tebuconazole or the propiconazole. That's also a good program that you could use. How do you keep up in trying to understand when the big infections are coming? Generally, it's going to be those rainy periods. Again, the temperature is going to be warm for at least for a couple of days to get high infection. One thing that can help you understand when those big risk periods are, when you really need to have a fungicide applied before we get into some high risk days, is this Boxwood Blight risk model that was created by some researchers out at Oregon State. And what it uses is weather data, primarily rainfall and temperature, to give a blight risk rating. This tells you when we're going to get most of our infections. So this is one that I just printed out downloaded this morning. And you can see we're at May 18th. And last year's infection ratings or risk ratings were these blue bars. And this year's is the black bars. So anything down here with very low risk or low risk, there's really very little chance that you're going to get any infection. Then you're going to little bump up to the first infection leaves all the way up to this high risk level. And these two levels up here, these are the ones we really want to protect our plants from. And you can see that last year at May 12th, we had a day that was very high risk. So far this year, most of the days, and you can go back and look at past weather, and it's been relatively low risk so far. A couple, we just haven't had a lot of rainfall in that temperature range. So, this weekend with some predicted rainfall, we're going to bump up into the lowest, risk of infection. So that can give you a little bit of way. I'm getting a little bit off into the weeds here, but just keeping up with this can give you an idea. Okay, this is a time period I see in the future 5 days, we're at high risk. You want to spray a fungicide and protect the plants before you get into that high risk, before those rainy days. That's critical because, again, these fungicides prevent the disease. And so you got to have the fungicide on before the risk and before the infection occurs. All right. So a couple other things, again, when you have severe disease symptoms like these plants in this picture, this was in a shaded location, poor air circulation, perfect conditions. My recommendation was to pull out these plants and don't ever put boxwoods back here again. It was just such a closed in area that always seemed to stay wet and was perfect conditions for it. And in some of those super severe, locations with a super severe history, just avoid planting boxwoods, even the resistant ones back there. It's time to plant something else. Okay, in this case, you can see this in this American boxwood. There's just a little infection starting on this one portion of the plant, and it's on the shady side of that plant. There's a lot of boxwoods in this property, and it just was limited to, here's a plant over here, one of the plants in that shady spot. But in this case, in these new, let's say there was just this one spot, this might be a location where I come in and just prune out that plant, the infected portion of the plant, before I remove that plant. And start with a fungicide program immediately after pruning, see how it goes. But you may be able to save this boxwood. These plants out in the sunny location, better air circulation, less risk. But I would spray every boxwood on the property once I found boxwood blight just in that one spot. So that's all I have for today. And I'd love to answer any questions, or if in the future I can help you identify your boxwood problems or identify boxwood blight or answer questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Jacoby. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A and also in the chat. The first question we got from Judy, and she asks, how do you treat black spots, maybe fungus, on large azaleas?
You know, there's a couple leaf spots that get on azaleas. Most of them, Cercospora leaf spot is probably the most common one that I see. And in most cases, the fungicides that I recommended for boxwood blight, like Daconil, work well for it. If I had a sprinkler irrigation, I'd really want to limit that and make sure that I'm not watering early in the morning so I don't get the leaves wet. And also, in some cases, some of these fungi are related to fertility. So making sure that I'm keeping up with a good fertility program, I think that can also help. And in general, leaf spots on azaleas, I consider pretty much a minor disease. Although they look bad, I've never seen an azalea killed by a leaf spot.
Our next question comes from Robert Haynes. Would sky pencil holly also be susceptible to boxwood blight?
No. So any type of holly would be resistant. And like I said, basically anything but boxwood, pachysandra, or sarcococca. So those would be resistant to it. Although I find a lot of other problems with sky pencil holly. They're really susceptible to root rot. And so it's not a plant that I would recommend over a boxwood or some other plants, other types of hollies.
I believe you touched on this, but Cindy wanted to know what they should spray with when it comes to, I guess, dealing with blight.
Yeah, so when you're dealing with boxwood blight, the three fungicides that I mentioned, either Daconil, the chlorothalonil products, tebuconazole, or propiconazole, like the Fertilome systemic fungicide, those are the three that I recommend. Those are all available to homeowners, widely available, should be able to find them pretty easily. And those are the ones that I recommend. I haven't found any, copper is one potential one that's an organic fungicide that does have some suppression. It's not great though. Some of the other products like neem oil just won't give any control of boxwood blight though.
And that was the next question. Nicole wanted to know about neem oil.
Yeah, that's going to be totally ineffective against boxwood blight.
Harold wanted to know what to use for Volutella. Did I say that right?
Yeah, you said it right. So it's Volutella Blight. And, with Volutella Blight, it often occurs on plants that are stressed. So the basic thing, besides pruning out the damaged areas, is to do everything you can to keep a healthy boxwood. That means checking the fertility, making sure the pH is kind of in that sweet spot for boxwood, which is about 6.5 to 7.2. Yearly fertility with a slow release fertilizer. Could be an organic fertilizer, it could be synthetic like Osmocote, but according to the soil test requirements. And keeping the plants so they don't get stressed, especially drought stress. Boxwoods are generally pretty drought tolerant, but when we have a really severe drought like we had back in 2016, that can cause future problems. It's a slow developing disease. I, in some cases, using fungicides, but typically after you prune, something like Daconil would be something that you could use, and it would protect against Boxwood Blight too. Although, I wouldn't expect, fungicides are just kind of the last resort. I always stress, good plant care and proper pruning and things like that, because those seem to be the most important.
Victor said, has blight been reported in any Kingsville boxwoods? It's a popular variety for bonsai.
Say the variety again.
Kingsville boxwood, and he has the correct name for it. It's Buxus microphylla compacta.
Okay. I don't know off the top of my head. There was a great study that combined data from all the studies that came out last year, and I can provide you the paper to it. But it reviewed over 100 different boxwoods that have been studied as far as their susceptibility, and you should be able to find that boxwood on that list and see if it's resistant or not. So we can follow up on that. Just email me.
Okay. And Holly just asked, do I bring soil to be tested in order to find out my boxwood plant fertility?
The best way to do that, we have soil test kits here at the Botanical Gardens. We have a table downstairs that has a drop-off box, so you can bring samples of diseased plants and put them in the box for me. And then right next to that, we have soil test boxes and forms that you can collect a sample and send it to our lab on campus down at Auburn. It costs $7 for a sample. And usually within less than a week after you send it, you should get back the results. And then if you have any questions about the results, feel free to reach out and ask me, any questions about what the best fertilizer to use based on that soil test.
Okay. And can you just reiterate the best way for people to contact you in order to diagnose any pest or disease?
Probably the best way is you can go to our website, aces.edu, ACES.edu, and there's a directory. You can look up my name. It'll have all my contact information, but you can also email me at jacobjc, and I'll put that in at auburn.edu. And I can put that in the chat. And also I'll put my telephone number, and you can also feel free to contact me that way too. And on the website, it also has my cell phone that you can contact me. So there's 3 ways. You can contact me in the lab. You can contact me via email and by cell phone too. And if I'm not available, Caroline Rowan works with me in the lab, and she would also be another person to contact if you have any questions or you want to submit a sample. That's a great way to reach out to us.
Well, thank you so much for today. I believe, let me make sure that goes out to the public. Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I think you gave us a lot of good answers to a lot of questions and a lot of information about boxwoods. I did get a question via email that I forwarded to you earlier today. So if that person is on the web, our Zoom today, just know that your email has been forwarded and that Dr. Jacoby will reach out to you to let you know that answer. And thank you, John, for being a partner and doing the introduction today. Is there anything you want to share with everyone about Alabama Green Industry that's coming up or anything?
Well, no, just appreciate the support and being able to work with you all on this good educational opportunity for folks, not only in Birmingham Metro, but across the state. And thanks to Dr. Jacoby, what he does for supporting horticulture efforts of so many folks. So.
All right, thanks for joining us, y'all, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks, where our next Lunch and Learn will be, just give me 1 second. Our next Lunch and Learn is going to be June 1st. Or did I pick the wrong one? Oh yeah, it's June 1st, and it is going to be Container Vegetables with Amanda Clark, who was a horticulturalist here at Birmingham Botanical Gardens. She worked for the city of Birmingham. So if you're interested in learning more about container vegetables, join us on June 1st at 11:30 to learn all about that from Amanda Clark. And we will see y'all in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.